Before we begin tonight's long story, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe you're lying in bed or resting quietly in a chair. I'd love for you to share with us in the comments what time it is where you are listening from. I always enjoy seeing people from all around the world gathered here for history. And if you find these slow, calming journeys into the past relaxing, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us keep creating these hours of quiet history for sleep every night. Now, let's begin. Asterisk, the march toward Baghdad did not begin at the gates of the city. It began years earlier in the distant heartlands of Mongolia, when Hülegü Khan, a grandson of Genghis, was given his command. To understand why Baghdad fell, you must imagine not only the clash of armies, but the long preparation of roads, supply lines, and orders that carried horsemen across continents. The Mongols were not new to conquest. By the mid-13th century, they had already burned their way across northern China, subdued the Khwarezmian Empire, and tested their strength against the kingdoms of Eastern Europe. Yet, Baghdad was different. The key was not merely a city. It was the symbolic heart of the Islamic world, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, a figure who held spiritual authority across lands far beyond the Tigris. Hülegü's campaign was no sudden strike. In 1253, his brother, Hülegü Khan, who sat as Great Khan in Karakorum, ordered him to move west. His mission was carefully defined: subdue the remaining Muslim states that had resisted Mongol power, including the assassins of Alamat in Persia, and then proceed toward Baghdad. Imagine the scale of the journey. Tens of thousands of horsemen, each with multiple horses, herds of sheep and cattle for food, wagons loaded with equipment, siege engines disassembled and dragged across deserts and mountains. It was not an army that moved lightly, despite the Mongols' reputation for speed. Instead, it was a migrating force, a moving city of warriors and families. Craftsmen and cooks traveled with their lives on horseback. The Persian chronicler Juvayni, who later served under Hülegü, described this movement with awe. From the steppes into Iran, the Mongols advanced like a tide, overwhelming the fortresses of the Ismailis in their mountain strongholds. The fabled citadel of Alamet, long thought impregnable, fell in 1256 after a careful siege. This victory cleared Hülegü's flank before Baghdad, ensuring that the feared assassins would not harry his rear. For the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, Key's early moves should have been warning enough, but the city had grown used to hearing of distant Mongol storms that broke over others' lands. Baghdad itself had not faced a major external enemy in centuries. The caliphs had grown more ceremonial, their armies weaker, their palaces rich, with protocol but then in real command. As Hülegü's forces swept through Persia, they established camps along fertile valleys, carefully managing their supplies. Mongol armies did not live off sudden plunder alone. They required grazing for their horses, fodder, and coordinated logistics. This was a machine of conquest fueled by precision. Even the boring details mattered. How many sacks of grain were carried? How many wells could sustain men and animals? How long wagons could last before repair? Each calculation made Baghdad's fate more certain. The Mongols also used engineers from across their empire. Chinese, Persian, and even captured European artisans marched with them, building siege towers, mangonels, and devices capable of hurling massive stones. These machines were disassembled into parts and carried like bones of some great beast, waiting to be reassembled before Baghdad's walls. The journey was not without obstacles. Mountains cut across Persia, rivers swelled with snowmelt, and tribal resistance flared here and there. But the Mongols moved with methodical force. Towns that resisted were burned. Those that submitted were spared only partially. Refugees carried tales of slaughter, sending waves of fear ahead of Hülegü's march. In Baghdad itself, the news was conflicting. Some messengers reported that the Mongols had destroyed entire regions. Others claimed that they preferred negotiation if submission was offered. The Abbasid court debated, but the Caliph, Al-Mustasim, remained indecisive. His advisors quarreled some urgent preparation, others dismissing the danger. After all, Baghdad was vast, its walls thick, its river a natural moat. Who could imagine that it might truly fall? But Hülegü's march was not stopping. Apaya 1257. His forces were descending into Mesopotamia, their path already cleared by years of steady advance. Along the way, they established depots, measured distances, and calculated timing so that when they reached Baghdad, they would not arrive exhausted but fully supplied. The scene must be imagined slowly. Columns of horsemen stretching across plains, their armor glinting, their horses snorting clouds of breath in winter air, cairns creaking under the weight of timbers for siege machines, herds driven by mounted shepherds, providing the food that sustained the army. Each day's march was another tightening of the noose around Baghdad. The people of Baghdad, meanwhile, continued their routines. Merchants sold spices and cloth in the bazaars. Scholars read and copied texts in the great libraries. Families bathed in the hammams, gossiped in the markets, prayed in the mosques. Life went on as though the tidal wave moving toward them was still too distant to disturb their daily rhythm, and yet the fear was spreading. Refugees from the north told of towns where entire populations had been killed. They spoke of rivers clogged with bodies of cities burned to ash. Some in Baghdad dismissed these tales as exaggerations. Others listened uneasily, wondering if their own fate was sealed. The march of Hülegü Khan's army toward Baghdad was more than a military operation. It was a slow reshaping of the political map. Each fortress destroyed, each tribe subdued, each ally secured brought the Abbasid Caliph closer to his hour of reckoning. The Mongols did not move like raiders who struck and vanished. They moved like a tide, steady and unstoppable. And so, says Iten Nambai Wushati, turned to Iten Nambai Wushaba. Hülegü camped ever closer to the Tigris. His forces gathered, his engines prepared, his supply lines secured. The city of Baghdad, ancient and proud, glittered still on the riverbank, its domes shining in the sun, its people bustling through their ordinary lives. The question that lingered in the air was simple and yet unanswered. Did the Caliph truly understand the storm that was about to break over his city? The winter of 1257 was not only cold in the lands of Mesopotamia, but heavy with unease. By this time, Hülegü's army had fully crossed into the Abbasid sphere, and the distance between the Mongols and Baghdad was shrinking day by day. Still, inside the caliphal court, hesitation ruled. The Caliph Al-Mustasim was not an unlearned man, but he was neither decisive nor strong in the manner his office demanded. His predecessors had lived in centuries of relative security, presiding over Baghdad as ceremonial figureheads rather than warlords, while other Islamic dynasties had risen and fallen. The Seljuks, the Buyids, the Fatimids, the Abbasid caliphs had retained spiritual authority even when stripped of political power. The great danger was that Al-Mustasim believed that sacred prestige alone could guard his city. When Hülegü sent envoys demanding surrender, the caliph's advisors argued bitterly over how to respond. Some urged negotiation, to send tribute, to yield partial authority, to buy time. Others insisted that Baghdad's walls and numbers were enough, and that the caliph should not bow before an infidel conqueror. Flattery, arrogance, and piety mingled in these debates, creating paralysis where action was needed. Meanwhile, Hülegü's preparations continued with methodical calm. The Mongols were experts at dividing their forces into precise units. Tens of thousands of cavalry were organized into two-men's groups of 10,000 each. Within each tamen, strict discipline reigned. Soldiers could not desert. Food was distributed evenly, and punishments for theft or neglect were swift. Engineers marched alongside them, specialists who could bridge rivers, level earthworks, or assemble siege machines in a matter of days. Baghdad was a jewel by comparison, but a jewel poorly set. Its defenses, though impressive on paper, had not been tested by a major siege in centuries. The city was encircled by walls, and the Tigris River curved around its heart, forming a natural barrier. Yet, the garrison was underprepared, and the commanders divided. Caliph had not stockpiled supplies for a lengthy defense, nor had he adequately rallied allies. He sent appeals to surrounding Muslim rulers, while many of them, terrified of Mongol retribution, chose silence or vague promises. The Abbasid Caliphate, once the unifying center of Islam, discovered too late that centuries of ceremonial prestige did not translate into real support. Few were willing to die for Al-Mustasim when Hülegü's armies loomed so near. Refugees streamed into Baghdad as the Mongols drew closer. Villages abandoned, fields left empty, caravans disrupted all, created a swelling tide of displaced people. Markets became crowded with strangers, many of them carrying little more than stories of horror. They spoke of Mongol columns appearing like smoke on the horizon, of towns obliterated in a single day, of massacres that spared neither the young nor the old. These tales darkened the mood of the city. And yet, life in Baghdad did not stop. Bazaars opened each morning. Scholars debated in madrasas. Muezzins called the faithful to prayer. Daily rhythms continued, as though clinging to normalcy could hold back catastrophe. The Mongols advanced with careful calculation. Their scouts rode ahead, mapping the terrain, probing for weaknesses, noting the locations of fords across rivers. Supply depots, established months earlier, now became critical. Staging points. Herds of horses grazed in controlled pastures, ready to replace those worn down by the march. Smiths worked day and night to keep weapons in repair. Nothing was left to chance. One of Hülegü's greatest advantages was psychological warfare. The reputation of Mongol ferocity often defeated cities before a single arrow was loosed. Chroniclers tell us that towns sometimes surrendered at the mere sight of dust clouds raised by Mongol horsemen. Letters sent to rulers across the Middle East carried a stark message: submit or be destroyed. The formula rarely varied, and those who tested it discovered the truth of the warning to late Baghdad, however, was not an ordinary city. For Muslims across the world, it was the residence of the Caliph, successor to the Prophet Muhammad in spiritual authority. The fall of Baghdad would be more than a military loss, it would be a religious and cultural wound. Hülegü knew this, and he pressed forward with confidence, certain that the weight of Mongol momentum could not be resisted. By January 1258, his army was encamped on the outskirts of the city. Chroniclers estimate anywhere from 100,000 to 150,000 men under his command, though precise numbers are elusive. What is certain is that he possessed overwhelming superiority. Siege engines were assembled from timbers dragged across Persia, massive catapults capable of hurling stones heavier than a man. Trapusets stood on prepared platforms, their counterweights ready to smash Baghdad's walls. Inside the city, confusion reigned. Some citizens urged flight, but the gates were closed. Others clung to faith, believing divine intervention would save them. The Caliph himself still trusted that the prestige of his office might dissuade Hülegü, or that reinforcements might arrive from distant allies. Neither hope was realistic. The Mongols began their encirclement of Baghdad with frightening efficiency. They diverted streams and dug trenches, cutting the city off from outside aid. Camps were laid in a ring, each division assigned its sector. Signal fires and flags coordinated movements. creating a living barrier around the Abbasid capital. For the first time in centuries, Baghdad's walls stood before a foe who did not fear them. K's engines were rolled into place, archers stationed in endless ranks. The city was vast, but the Mongols were patient. They had crossed mountains and deserts. They could afford to wait, and so the stage was set. Inside the walls, it's a city of nearly 1 million souls, trusting in faith and tradition. Outside, a war machine tuned by decades of conquest, ready to unleash destruction on a scale Baghdad had never known. The moment of impact was coming, and it could no longer be delayed. The question that weighed upon every inhabitant of the city was quiet but piercing. What would become of Baghdad when the first Mongol stones fell against its walls? Its asterisk, the encirclement of Baghdad in early 1258, was more than a military maneuver, was the final tightening of a noose that had been prepared for years. The Mongol army now stood in full strength before the Abbasid capital, its siege engines towering, its cavalry stretching in every direction across the plain. The first stones from Mongol trebuchets were loosed in late January. They thundered against the city's walls, shaking the earth beneath the defenders' feet. Each impact sent shudders through the population, not only from the physical damage, but from the psychological weight. For generations, Baghdadis had believed their city to be untouchable, protected by faith and prestige. Now, the illusion cracked. Along with the stones of the wall, Hülegü's engineers worked tirelessly. They built earthen ramps, dug trenches, and positioned machines with precision. Arrows rained from Mongol archers, their bows short but powerful, capable of piercing armor at close range. Firepots were launched to ignite buildings. Slowly, steadily, the walls weakened. Inside, the situation deteriorated. Supplies dwindled. Refugees crammed into the city had already strained resources before the siege began, and now scarcity became urgent. Prices of grain soared. Clean water grew scarce. Panic whispered through the streets. The Caliph, almost to seem still uncertain, attempted one last effort at negotiation. He sent envoys to Hülegü, offering terms of submission. But it was too late. Hülegü no longer saw tribute or promises. He wanted the city itself. Chroniclers suggest that the Mongol commander may have initially left a narrow path open for the Caliph to surrender early. But Al-Mustasim's delay had sealed his fate. On February 6, 1258, the Mongols breached the outer defenses. Their engineers had diverted part of the Tigris, creating a dry approach to the walls. Siege towers advanced, mangonels pounded the breaches, and cavalry surged through openings. The defenders collapsed. Within days, resistance ended. Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, was in Mongol hands. What followed was devastation, on a scale that stunned even contemporaries. For a week, the city was given over to massacre and destruction. The exact numbers are disputed. Some chronicles speak of hundreds of thousands killed, others of fewer, but all sources agree that the slaughter was immense. Men, women, and children were cut down. Mosques, palaces, and markets burned. House of Wisdom, that fabled center of learning, was destroyed, its manuscripts cast into the Tigris until it was said. The river ran black with ink. Al-Mustasim himself was captured. Tradition held that Mongols avoided spilling royal blood on the ground, so the Caliph was reportedly rolled into a carpet and trampled to death by horses. Whether legend or fact, his death marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate as a political force in Baghdad. Spiritual title would later be revived in Cairo under Mamluk protection, but never again would it carry the same global authority. Amid the wreckage, only fragments of life remained. Some artisans and scholars were spared, taken into Mongol service. Merchants who could prove their usefulness were allowed to live. But the city, as it had been the thriving center of Islamic learning, commerce, and culture, was gone. Hülegü, for his part, did not linger. The conquest of Baghdad was one stage in a broader campaign to extend Mongol control across the Middle East. He established administrative order, garrisoned the ruins, and moved on, leaving the memory of destruction behind him as a warning to others for the Islamic world. The fall of Baghdad was not simply a military loss, but a civilizational wound. The Abbasids had ruled since the 8th century, their capital, a beacon of scholarship and trade. Its fall shattered the sense of continuity that had bound the Muslim world together. Scholars lamented the destruction of knowledge, poets grieved for the loss of culture, and chroniclers recorded the trauma with sorrow. And yet, history does not end in one moment. Baghdad did not vanish entirely. Survivors rebuilt portions of the city. Trade eventually returned, though on a smaller scale. Other dynasties rose. Other empires claimed authority. But the memory of 1258 remained, echoing in chronicles for centuries. As a reminder of fragility, the road to Baghdad, which had begun years earlier with Hülegü's westward march, ended not with negotiations or tribute, but with ruin. The logistics, the preparations, the careful encirclement, the dull mechanics of Mongol warfare had led to one of the most shocking collapses in medieval history. And so, the question that lingered long after the smoke cleared was not simply why Baghdad fell, but something more unsettling. How could a city so great, so storied, so central to a civilization, be destroyed in only a matter of days? Baghdad was not a city without defenses. When Hülegü Khan's forces approached in 1258, the Abbasid capital still stood as one of the largest and most sophisticated urban centers in the medieval world. With its immense size, rivers, and walls, Baghdad had long been considered unconquerable. Yet, when the Mongols came, those defenses proved fragile. To understand why, you must walk slowly through the city's fortifications, its waterworks, and its preparations, or lack thereof. In the days before the siege began, the foundation of Baghdad's defense was its geography. The city sat on the Tigris River, its heart divided by the waters that had nourished Mesopotamian civilizations for millennia. Rivers were both lifelines and barriers. They provided water for drinking, irrigation, and transport, but they also formed natural moats. Baghdad's builders had taken advantage of this geography when shaping the city centuries earlier. The Round City, originally designed under Caliph al-Mansur in the 8th century, was intended as a fortress capital. High walls encircled the urban core, punctuated by monumental gates. Later expansions had stretched far beyond the original circle, yet the principle remained. Baghdad relied on walls and water for its security. By the 13th century, the city's perimeter included a combination of stone walls, fortified gates, and the wide waters of the Tigris. But walls are only as strong as the men who defend them. Here lay one of Baghdad's greatest weaknesses. Al-Mustasim's garrison was poorly trained and underprepared. Chroniclers note that while the city still had thousands of inhabitants, few were seasoned fighters. Many soldiers were mercenaries or conscripts with little loyalty to the caliph. The regular army had atrophied, drained by court rivalries and mismanagement. When compared to the disciplined tumens of Hülegü's army, the imbalance was striking. Another issue was supply. City under siege must be able to withstand long isolation, but Baghdad's preparation was woefully inadequate. Grain reserves were limited. Warehouses had not been filled for a drawn-out struggle. Some food stores existed, but they were insufficient for the enormous population, which swelled further as refugees poured in from surrounding regions. The very geography that had once protected Baghdad now worked against it, as the influx of displaced villagers increased the mouths to feed inside its walls. Water, too, was a double-edged sword. The Tigris was a blessing in peace and a potential hazard in war. The Abbasids had built canals and dikes to control the river, creating a complex irrigation network that sustained agriculture around the city. In theory, This network could be used as a defensive measure flooding fields, hindering enemy movements. But by the 13th century, the system was neglected. Years of administrative decay had left canals silted, dikes weakened, and control structures in disrepair. When the Mongols arrived, they quickly understood how to exploit this weakness. They diverted streams, drained channels, and turned Baghdad's lifeline into a tool of siege. One must also consider the state of Baghdad's walls. On parchment, they were formidable, thick masonry, tall towers, and guarded gates. But in reality, they were vulnerable. Centuries of relative peace had dulled the urgency of constant repair. Sections were crumbling, mortar weakened, battlements unmanned. The people of Baghdad still believed in their symbolic strength. But symbols do not stop trebuchet stones. Inside the city, preparations were further undermined by politics. Ohm's Decium was indecisive, his court divided by factions submerged. Immediate reinforcement of the walls and stockpiling of supplies. Others argued that God's protection and the caliph's sacred authority were shield enough. Piety blurred into complacency. In the end, little was done. No grand mobilization, no disciplined militia training, no large-scale strengthening of the fortifications. The caliph hesitated, and hesitation in the face of the Mongols was fatal. Yet, to the ordinary residents, life still carried on. Blacksmiths hammered tools in workshops. Merchants sold spices and textiles in the bustling bazaars. Students sat in study circles at the madrasas. Families prayed in mosques, confident that their city, cradle of the Abbasids, could not fall. After all, had not Baghdad survived crises before? Floods, fires, political intrigues all had scarred the city, but none had destroyed it. Why should these nomadic horsemen, however fearsome, succeed where others had failed? There was one final weakness, less visible, but equally dangerous: overconfidence. Baghdad's grandeur had lulled its leaders into believing it was eternal. But walls require vigilance, rivers demand maintenance, and armies must be drilled. Without these, defenses are little more than illusions. By the time Hülegü's forces reached the city's outskirts, the balance was already tipped. The Mongols brought with them engineers who could break walls, logisticians who could cut supplies, and cavalry who could patrol every road. Baghdad's defenses walls, water, and men were fragile, brittle shells awaiting the first hammer blow. And so the question grew heavier in those final days before the siege. Were the walls of Baghdad truly guardians of the city, or had they already become its tombstones, waiting only for the Mongols to carve the epitaph? The siege of a city is not simply a clash of arms. It is a test of preparation against pressure, endurance against hunger, and faith against fear. Baghdad, by the winter of 1258, found itself unprepared in almost every practical sense. To see why, we must look more closely at the invisible mechanics of siege survival, the stores of food, the flow of water, the morale of the people, those quiet, boring details that ultimately decided the fate of the Abbasid capital. When Hülegü's forces completed their encirclement of the city, cut off every road, canal, and path that might bring supplies in or people out, Baghdad, vast as it was, instantly became a prison for its own population. The number of people inside the walls was immense. Chroniclers estimate close to 1 million inhabitants in the broader urban area, though exact figures are debated. Refugees from outlying villages had swollen that number further. What had been a thriving city became an overcrowded trap, its granaries and storehouses far too small for the mouths that depended on them. Food shortages appeared quickly. Bread, the most basic staple, became scarce within weeks. Merchants who had once sold flour in abundance began rationing what little they had left. Prices soared, and soon only the wealthy could afford to eat regularly. The poor relied on scraps, on whatever they could scavenge. Chroniclers speak of people grinding date pits or mixing sawdust with flour in desperate attempts to stretch meager supplies. This was not the result of the Mongol bombardment yet, but of the city's failure to prepare long before. Water, too, became uncertain. The Tigris flowed through the heart of Baghdad, but access to it was not guaranteed. Mongol engineers diverted streams, and their control of the riverbanks made it perilous for citizens to draw water freely. Wells inside the city helped, but many had fallen into disrepair after years of neglect. The Abbasid irrigation network, once the marvel of Mesopotamia, was already in decline by the 13th century, and the siege exposed its fragility. Clean water became a daily worry, compounding the misery of hunger. Hygiene deteriorated as well. In a city so crowded, waste disposal was already a problem. Under siege, with refuse piling up and clean water limited, disease spread easily, though few chronicles dwell on these mundane details. They mattered as much as arrows and stones. Illness weakened defenders, frightened civilians, and turned the city itself into a kind of ally for the besiegers. The walls of Baghdad, formidable in outline, became objects of grim scrutiny. Citizens climbed the ramparts to watch the Mongols' siege engines rise across the plain. Each day, the thunder of mangonels and trebuchets grew louder, their stones smashing against masonry. Repairs were attempted, but with poor coordination and low morale, they were patchwork at best. Defenders fired arrows from the battlements, yet the range and power of Mongol engines outmatched them. Slowly, confidence in the walls as protectors began to fade. Still, life inside the city did not immediately collapse. Bazaars continued, albeit in diminished form. Mosques called the faithful to prayer. Teachers lectured students in madrasas, perhaps with trembling voices as the ground shook. From distant impacts, people clung to normal routines, as though by doing so they could push back the reality of siege. Faith was a shield many grasped tightly. Preachers declared that God would protect the Caliph city. Others spoke of miracles from Islamic history, urging the people to remain steadfast. But faith could not silence the rumors. Refugees who had escaped earlier Mongol attacks told stories that circulated endlessly. Whole towns slaughtered, rivers running red, corpses piled high. The more the stones fell on Baghdad's walls, the more these stories seemed not exaggerations, but warnings of what awaited inside the court of Abbasid. Uncertainty hardened into paralysis. His viziers disagreed bitterly. Some urged the Caliph to negotiate while there was still time. Others clung to pride, insisting that Baghdad's sacred status would shield it. Abbasid wavered, sending mixed messages, delaying crucial decisions. Instead of unity, there was division. Instead of strategy, hesitation. The Mongols, meanwhile, displayed no such confusion. Their lines were organized, their supply depots stocked, their engineers methodical. Each trebuchet stone was a declaration of inevitability. Each day that passed without relief tightened the noose further. By late January, the imbalance between appearance and reality had become undeniable. Baghdad still possessed walls, water, and faith, but the walls were cracking, the water controlled by the enemy, and faith alone could not fill empty stomachs. For the people inside, the hardest realization was not that the Mongols were powerful, but that their own city had not truly prepared. The defenses that looked so grand had been hollow, like old timber eaten from within. When tested, they gave way. And so, as hunger deepened and bombardment grew heavier, a question pressed itself onto the hearts of Baghdad's citizens. What was stronger, the faith that had carried their city for centuries, or the stone and iron that battered its walls each day? The final measure of any city's defense is not in its walls or rivers, but in its people. As the Mongol siege tightened, in early February 1258, Baghdad's citizens found themselves pressed against the limits of endurance. The walls were shaking, the Tigris was no longer theirs, and hunger gnawed at every household. What remained was willpower, and even that was eroding from the ramparts. Defenders watched as Mongol siege engines loomed higher each day. Great counterweight trebuchets, assembled from timbers dragged across Persia, hurled stones heavier than oxen into the walls. The sound was relentless, the groan of wood, the whistle of stones, the thunder of impact. Each strike dislodged blocks of masonry, sending dust clouds rolling across the streets. Repairs were attempted, but the rubble grew faster than it could be replaced. Men who had once trusted in their city's invulnerability now looked nervously at every crack. Inside the markets, food was nearly gone. Those who had gold or silver could still buy bread, but at absurd prices. The poor starved quietly in alleyways. Families boiled weeds or chewed leather to dull their hunger. Disease stalked the crowded quarters, spread by bad water and rotting waste. The city that had once been a beacon of prosperity had become a prison of scarcity. And yet, daily rituals persisted. The call to prayer still echoed across the rooftops. Scholars still opened their books, even if only a handful of students came to listen. Merchants still sat at empty stalls, as if by keeping their places, they could preserve the illusion of life before the siege. It was human stubbornness, the refusal to believe that tomorrow could be worse than today. In the caliphal palace, however, confusion reigned. Abbasid, urged by some of his advisors, made belated attempts at negotiation. But by then, Hülegü's position was unassailable. The Mongols had breached too many cities to be deterred by promises. Their camp, disciplined and methodical, offered no cracks for diplomacy to exploit. The caliph's envoys returned with little hope. At the walls, morale dwindled further. Soldiers deserted their posts under cover of night, slipping into the maze of Baghdad streets. Others surrendered outright, convinced that fighting was useless. Commanders barked orders, but their voices carried no conviction. Unlike the Mongols, who lived under strict military codes, the Abbasid defenders lacked unity. They were individuals defending their lives, not a disciplined machine fighting for conquest. The Tigris, once Baghdad's guardian, became a weapon against it. Mongol engineers diverted its waters, flooding some areas and drying others, shaping the terrain to their advantage. Canals that had once nourished fields now choked with silt and ruin. The city that had grown great on the back of irrigation now felt its lifelines turned against it. For the people inside, the days blurred into one another. Stone impacts, collapsing walls, dwindling food, rumors of massacre. Fear hollowed out the once proud city. Those who had mocked the tales of Mongol ferocity now whispered them in terror. The silence of allies beyond the walls confirmed their isolation. By February 5th, breaches had widened. Mongol troops probed weak points, preparing for the final assault. Smoke from burning suburbs drifted across the river, darkening the sky. The defenders clung desperately to the last intact sections of wall, but it was only a matter of time. What is striking, when chroniclers describe these final days, is the sense of inevitability. Baghdad's preparations, its walls, its water, its faith were insufficient against an enemy who had mastered every detail of siegecraft. The city's grandeur, its cultural wealth, its centuries of prestige. None of it could stop trebuchet stones or famine. And so, as the Mongols prepared to storm the breaches, Baghdad's fate was sealed. The city that had believed itself untouchable stood on the brink of annihilation. The question that lingered in those hours, heavy as the smoke that hung over the river, was simple but devastating. If even Baghdad could fall, what city in the world could ever truly be safe? Asterisk. in the winter of 1258, while Hülegü Khan's armies drew their circle ever tighter around Baghdad. The caliphal palace still glowed with a strange, almost surreal splendor. Within its walls, the routines of ceremony and courtly life continued, as though the city beyond were not facing annihilation. The Abbasid Caliphs had reigned in Baghdad for over 5 centuries. By al-Mustasim's time, the power of the office had shrunk dramatically, but its ceremonial majesty had not. The palace was a world apart. Great halls hung with silk, fountains murmuring in courtyards, scented lamps glowing in the chambers. Servants padded silently across tiled floors. Eunuchs directed the flow of courtiers, and scribes copied documents with patient strokes of reed pens. The city outside might tremble, but here tradition reigned. At the heart of this order was ritual. Each day the caliph held court, receiving advisors, scholars, and petitioners. Protocol was elaborate, refined over centuries. The caliph entered in robes embroidered with gold, his seat placed beneath canopies that symbolized divine authority. Courtiers bowed deeply, addressing him with titles that traced lineage back to the prophet. These rituals did not merely flatter. They reinforced the illusion that the caliph's power was unshakable, that the Mongol threat was just another distant storm that would pass. Food and music accompanied this illusion. In the kitchens of the palace, cooks prepared delicacies from across the empire: lamb roasted with herbs, rice seasoned with saffron, sweet confections dripping with honey. Musicians played the oud and ney, their melodies drifting through the halls. Poets recited verses praising the caliph's lineage, reminding all present that Baghdad had once been the center of a world civilization. It was splendor and defiance. A fear. Yet beneath the ritual shimmered unease. Whispers circulated among the viziers and chamberlains. Some urged immediate negotiation with Hülegü, warning that delay would be fatal. Others, driven by pride or denial, insisted that Baghdad's sanctity as the seat of the caliph would protect it. Still others, perhaps more cynical, seemed paralyzed, unwilling to risk blame by speaking too strongly in either direction. The caliph himself, Caliphassim, sat at the center of this storm of hesitation. Contemporary accounts paint him as pious, but indecisive, a man more comfortable with ritual and ceremony than with command. He prayed regularly, recited the Quran, sought guidance in faith, but faith alone could not build armies or reinforce walls. His reliance on divine protection may have soothed him, but it left his city fatally unprepared. Court life insulated him, while merchants in the bazaars rationed bread and families in the alleys whispered of massacre. The caliph still presided over banquets, while Mongol trebuchets were dragged into place on the far banks of the Tigris. The court debated protocol, appointments, and ceremonial gifts. The contrast was staggering. A city on the edge of ruin, ruled by a court that clung to the forms of splendor, as though they were shields. There were those who tried to break through the illusion. Advisors warned of the Mongols' record, the destruction of Nishapur, the razing of Alamet, the devastation of countless cities. Some urged the caliph to gather reinforcements, to negotiate terms before it was too late. But their warnings fell into the endless churn of debate, where no decision outweighed another. Still, the palace glittered. Its gardens, watered by canals, held date, palms, and jasmine. Its treasury stored jewels, silks, and gold accumulated over centuries. Its libraries contained manuscripts, copied lovingly by generations of scribes. This wealth had been a symbol of Baghdad's enduring greatness. Now it was only bait, waiting to be seized. It is easy, in hindsight, to condemn the court for blindness. Yet, one must remember that Baghdad had survived so much before rebellions, invasions, dynastic struggles, even earlier Mongol threats. Why should this storm be different? Ritual and wealth had always seen them through. Why not again? And so, on the eve of collapse, the caliph's court continued in its shimmering rhythm, unaware, unwilling to accept that each banquet, each song, each prayer beneath gilded canopies might be its last. The question that hung in the incense-thick air of those chambers was one no ritual could answer. Could splendor itself protect a city, or was it only a veil hiding the cracks already splitting beneath? The Mongol siege engines had already begun their grim rhythm outside the city walls, and inside the caliphal palace, the rhythm of court life persisted with almost dreamlike detachment. To understand why, one must look closely at the machinery of the Abbasid court in its final days, the layers of officials, the flow of petitions, the slow grind of bureaucracy that created the illusion of control, even as the world beyond collapsed. The Abbasid palace was not simply a home for the caliph, but a sprawling complex of administrative offices. Within its chambers worked scribes, accountants, jurists, and secretaries, each managing some fraction of the empire's affairs. Documents were copied by hand in endless repetition. Tax records, appointments, decrees, religious endorsements. Even in crisis, these routines did not stop. The quills still scratched the parchment. The seals were pressed into wax. The clerks bent over their ledgers. To the bureaucrats, order was defined by the continuation of paperwork. Petitions still arrived. Merchants requested licenses. Scholars sought patronage. Provincial governors submitted reports. Few of these had relevance to the siege. Yet, the machinery of administration was slow to shift. It was as though the court was trapped in its own habits, too bound by tradition to respond to the immediacy of danger. The viziers debated constantly. Some argued that Baghdad's wealth could still buy peace. Others claimed that the Mongols would never dare desecrate the seat of the caliphate. Voices clashed in council chambers, but no clear strategy emerged. The caliph listened, nodded, sometimes offered pious remarks, and then withdrew to prayer. He neither galvanized his commanders nor sent decisive embassies. Each day that passed was a day wasted. Meanwhile, the palace itself projected magnificence. Its halls glowed with mosaics, its carpets soft beneath sandaled feet, its courtyards perfumed with rosewater. Servants presented trays of delicacies, even as grain ran short outside. Musicians still performed in the evenings, plucking strings and singing verses of past glories. Courtiers wore silk robes, their colors vivid against marble floors. These displays were not ignorance but habit. For centuries, the Abbasid court had maintained its prestige through splendor. To abandon such rituals now would have felt like surrender. And yet, beneath the perfumes and music, unease thickened. Eunuchs whispered rumors of Mongol cruelty. Scholars in the palace library murmured fears about the fate of their manuscripts. Guards shifted nervously at their posts, aware that their training was meager compared to the discipline of Mongol cavalry. Everyone knew the stories of Nishaper and Merv, cities annihilated within days. Everyone knew the Mongols spared little once a city resisted. Still, the palace clung to ceremony. Even as trebuchet stones crashed against Baghdad's walls, the caliph presided over banquets. Even as refugees begged at the city gates, court poets praised the eternal glory of the Abbasid line. It was not so much denial as inertia, the continuation of rituals that had once held real power but now floated empty, disconnected from reality. The irony was sharp. The caliph's court, which should have been the nerve center of defense, had become instead a theater of appearances. Its debates produced no action, its rituals no protection. Splendor had become a cage. In the city beyond, ordinary people looked toward the palace with anger as well as fear. Rumors spread that the caliph was hoarding wealth, that food was hidden in storerooms while the poor starved. Whether true or not, such stories deepened resentment. For many Baghdadis, the palace no longer symbolized divine authority, but aloofness, a ruler praying in silk while his people suffered. The Mongols understood this imbalance. Their envoys had already gauged the caliph's weakness. They knew that the palace glittered, but its glitter was hollow. Every hour that Baghdad failed to act strengthened Hülegü's hand, and so, night after night, the palace remained lit by lamps and candles, music threading through its corridors, prayers rising from its chambers. But outside those walls, the ground shook with bombardment, the sky darkened with smoke, and the city inched toward collapse. The question that grew heavier with each passing day was this: was the palace sustaining the caliphate, or was it merely performing its funeral rites in advance? Asterisk, the final days of Baghdad's caliphal court in February 1258 were not marked by decisive action, but by a strange mixture of ritual and resignation. Within the palace walls, splendor remained. The lamps still glowed, the carpets still softened. Each step, the gardens still perfumed the courtyards. But the rhythms of grandeur were out of joint with the reality pressing against the city's walls. The court was, in its last moments, both magnificent and powerless. Reports streamed in from the ramparts. Trebuchet stones were smashing breaches wider each day. The outer suburbs were already aflame. Refugees had poured through the gates until none could enter. The Tigris itself, once a source of confidence, was under Mongol control. Yet still, in the council chambers, the viziers debated as though time were limitless. Some advisors pleaded for surrender. They pointed to the Mongols' letters: submit and perhaps live, resist and be destroyed. Others counseled faith that Baghdad, seat of the caliphate, could not fall, for God himself would protect it. Still others, out of fear of blame, said little at all. The caliph listened, his piety genuine, but his judgment wavering. He prayed, recited verses, and withdrew into hesitation. In those hours, what Baghdad needed was command. What it received was silence. The palace rituals, meant to reinforce divine authority, now became almost theatrical. Banquets were still held, though with fewer dishes. Musicians still played, though their songs faltered. Poets still praised the Abbasid lineage, though their voices quivered under the distant thunder of siege engines. Even prayer in the palace mosques took on a tone of desperation, as though the words were recited not in confidence, but in hope. Against hope. For ordinary Baghdadis, the palace became a symbol of separation. In the bazaars, people starved. In the alleys, families huddled as stones crashed in the distance. Rumors spread that the caliph hoarded treasures, that food was stored in the palace while citizens went hungry. True or not, the perception was poisonous. The palace glittered while the city crumbled. Then came the breach. On February 6th, the Mongols stormed the walls. Their cavalry poured into the city. Panic spread like fire. The palace guards, untrained for such an onslaught, broke almost immediately. Courtiers and servants who had lived their lives within ritual and splendor now scattered in terror. Eunuchs fled. Viziers tried to bribe their way to safety. Scribes abandoned their ledgers. The machinery of ceremony collapsed in hours. The Caliph al-Mustasim was captured. Chroniclers differ on the exact details of his end, but all agree it was humiliating. He who had once been robed in silk and gold, attended by musicians and poets, now found himself in Mongol custody, his pleas ignored. The Abbasid court, which had cloaked itself in ritual for centuries, dissolved in a single moment of conquest. The palace treasures were seized. Gold, silks, manuscripts looted or destroyed. The gardens were trampled by horses, the halls filled with smoke. The libraries, once filled with careful copies of knowledge, were scattered or burned. The court that had defined splendor in the Islamic world was no more. What remained afterward was silence. The rituals ended. The titles meant nothing. The The courtly forms that had sustained the caliphate for centuries evaporated under Mongol swords. And so, the story of the caliphal court ended not with a grand defense, but with the collapse of ritual into ruin. Splendor had not protected it. Its ceremonies had not shielded it. The palace, in the end, had been only a mirror reflecting a power long gone. The question left behind was stark and sobering. Had Baghdad's court preserved its splendor for centuries, or had it only preserved the illusion of strength, an illusion that shattered the moment the Mongols walked through the gates? When Hülegü Khan's army encircled Baghdad in 1258, the decisive factor was not only the discipline of his cavalry, but the machinery of his siege engineers. The Mongols had learned early that horsemen alone could not conquer fortified cities. From northern China to Persia, they had encountered walls too high and gates too strong for arrows and charges to break. The solution was not to abandon their way of war, but to adopt and perfect new tools. By the time they reached Baghdad, they carried with them an arsenal of siegecraft as precise and deadly as their cavalry tactics. The Mongols were masters of absorption. From every land they conquered, they drew specialists into their ranks. Chinese engineers, Persian craftsmen, even prisoners from Europol were put to work in Mongol campaigns. Siege engines were a cosmopolitan craft, blending techniques from across Eurasia. The fall of Baghdad was thus not only a Mongol achievement, but the result of centuries of accumulated engineering knowledge wielded with ruthless efficiency. Among their most fearsome machines were the great counterweight trebuchets, known to the Mongols by the Persian term manyanik, or the Chinese hu hui pao. These devices could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds, unlike the older traction trebuchets, which required teams of men pulling ropes. The counterweight model used a massive box of stone or lead, swinging with precision to launch projectiles. Chroniclers describe stones smashing into Baghdad's walls with such force that towers cracked and battlements collapsed. The construction of these engines was itself an act of organization. Timbers were dragged for miles, cut, shaped, and assembled. On site, iron fittings were forged in mobile smithies that traveled with the army. Each trebuchet required dozens of men to build, maintain, and operate. Once in place, they became relentless instruments of pressure, pounding day and night until defenders' morale broke. Alongside trebuchets came mangonels, smaller but more mobile, capable of rapid fire. These hurled stones, firepots, and sometimes even jars filled with combustible oils or noxious materials against a city as vast as Baghdad. Every weapon mattered. The Mongols used mangonels not only to break walls, but to sow chaos inside, setting buildings ablaze and terrifying civilians. Siege towers also played their part. These towering wooden structures, rolled on great wheels, carried archers to the height of city walls. From there, they could rain arrows downward on defenders, suppressing resistance long enough for rams and ladders to approach. Covered in hides, soaked with vinegar to resist fire, the towers were slow but effective. Even the Tigris itself was turned into a weapon. Mongol engineers diverted its waters, controlling canals and dikes to flood or dry areas as needed. They used pontoon bridges to move troops, and they choked river approaches to cut off Baghdad's access to supplies. Water, once Baghdad's lifeline, became a tool of siege. One of the more chilling aspects of Mongol siegecraft was their use of intimidation through technology. Chroniclers report that the very sight of Mongol engines being assembled often caused towns to surrender without resistance. The machines were massive, their timbers creaking, their ropes groaning, their counterweights looming like beasts of war. To defenders, they seemed unstoppable, embodiments of inevitability. What made this siegecraft truly devastating was not only the machines themselves, but the discipline with which they were used. The Mongols coordinated cavalry patrols with artillery bombardment, ensuring that no relief force could approach. Engineers worked in shifts, keeping up constant pressure. Scouts watched for weak points in the walls, directing heavier bombardment. Where cracks appeared, nothing was left to chance. Inside Baghdad, the defenders struggled to respond. Their own engines were few and outdated. Attempts to hurl stones back at the besiegers were meager. The imbalance was stark. One side possessed a machine of conquest tuned by decades of practice. The other relied on outdated walls and fading faith. And so, as the Mongol trebuchets swung their counterweights and their mangonels launched firepods, Baghdad's fate was steadily sealed. The fall of a great city came not only from cavalry charges or sword clashes, but from the dull, repetitive mechanics of machines: rope, timber, stone, counterweight, boring details, but details that crushed empires. The question left hanging in the minds of those who watched the walls tremble was this: could faith, ritual, or tradition ever stand against the cold logic of engineering? Asterisk, if the Mongol cavalry embodied speed and terror across the open steppe, their siege engines embodied patience and inevitability when facing walls. By the time Hülegü's army surrounded Baghdad, the logic of these machines was already proven. City after city in Central Asia and Persia had fallen to the same dull rhythm. Engineers building, counterweights swinging, walls crumbling. Baghdad was no exception. It was simply the most glittering prize yet to feel the force of wood, stone, and rope. The great counterweight trebuchets dominated the siege. They were called by names that reflected their size and power. Chroniclers mention Al, Azuz, and Almabrak, titles of grandeur, as though the machines themselves were warriors. Each was a marvel of coordination. Huge beams were hauled upright, cross braces lashed tight, ropes wound thick. Iron fittings bound the timber joints. The counterweight itself, sometimes a box filled with rocks, sometimes slabs of lead, was hauled upward by teams of men using winches. When released, its weight pulled the arm down in an arc, hurling the projectile from its sling. The simplicity was deceptive. The effect was devastating. Stones were chosen with care. Large blocks shattered towers, while smaller missiles, released in succession, created relentless pounding that wore down defenders' morale. Sometimes incendiary pots filled with pitch or oil were added, turning impacts into bursts of fire. Witnesses wrote of entire wall sections collapsing after repeated strikes, masonry trembling as if struck by earthquakes. Mangonels and traction trebuchets supplemented the counterweights. These lighter engines could be moved more quickly, positioned near breaches, and aimed at defenders on the ramparts. Their rate of fire was higher, and though each stone was smaller, the effect was chaos. Tiles ripped from roofs, soldiers knocked from battlements, fires breaking out in markets. The combination of heavy and light engines created constant pressure. No part of the city could rest. Siege towers provided another layer of attack, rolled on enormous wheels, clad in soaked hides against fire. These towers carried squads of archers in their upper platforms. Archers could shoot down into the city, clearing parapets so that ladders and rams might advance. So slow and vulnerable, the towers gained protection from the Mongols' coordination. Cavalry guarded them, engineers repaired them, and archers inside fired in steady rhythm. Even more subtle was the Mongols' use of earthworks. Engineers filled trenches, leveled approaches, and built ramps, shovels, and baskets. They shifted the ground itself, reshaping the terrain to favor their machines. Where water blocked them, they diverted rivers. Where walls stood high, they raised mounds to equal the height. Such work was tedious, even boring, but it was decisive. Walls that once seemed insurmountable were gradually reduced to obstacles of wood and dirt. Chroniclers note that the Abbasid defenders attempted countermeasures. They hurled stones from their own engines, poured boiling oil and molten metal on attackers, and launched sorties from the gates. But their efforts were sporadic and poorly coordinated. Their engines were fewer and weaker. Their supplies of ammunition limited. Each counterattack was swallowed by Mongol organization. What made Mongol siegecraft terrifying was not only the machines themselves, but the unbroken rhythm they maintained. Day and night, stones flew. Shifts of engineers ensured that no hour passed without bombardment. The sound never ceased, the groan of ropes, the crash of impact, the cries of crumbling walls. For the defenders, this constancy was worse than the blows themselves. It eroded the spirit, turning each day into a waiting game for destruction. The Mongols also used psychological tricks with their engines. Sometimes they deliberately spared one section of wall, pounding instead on another, creating the illusion of safety. Defenders concentrated there, only to see the weaker section collapse suddenly under renewed bombardment. At other times, they launched firepods into markets or residential areas, not to breach walls, but to spread panic among civilians. The city was not merely defended by stone, it was defended by morale, and morale under constant assault cracked. Baghdad's citizens heard the siege not only with their ears, but with their bodies. The tremors of each impact shook through the earth, rattling jars on shelves, causing lamps to flicker, sending dust down from ceilings. Even those far from the walls could feel the siege engines at work. The city lived in the rhythm of their pounding. What is most striking in retrospect is how predictable it all was. The Mongols had repeated this pattern. Across Asia, the Abbasids knew of these methods, had heard the stories, perhaps even read detailed descriptions. And yet, when the trebuchets rose on the plain outside Baghdad, the defenders were unprepared. The truth was harsh. The fall of Baghdad did not come from the genius of a single Mongol leader or the betrayal of a single Abbasid commander. It came from the dull certainty of engineering, the careful building, the steady firing, the endless rhythm of stone against wall. The truth was harsh. The fall of Baghdad did not come from the genius of a single Mongol leader or the betrayal of a single Abbasid commander. It came from the dull certainty of engineering, the careful building, the steady firing, the endless rhythm of stone against wall. And so, as the walls cracked and the city trembled, a question grew heavier in the hearts of Baghdad's defenders. Was there any defense in the world strong enough to resist not passion, not faith, but the patient repetition of machines? The engines that battered Baghdad in 1258 were not remembered merely for their power, but for the way they embodied inevitability. For the people inside the city, the siege was not experienced as a sudden clash of arms, but as a steady, numbing rhythm, stones striking walls, timbers groaning, firepots bursting. Day after day, the noise became the city's new heartbeat. In many sieges, the initial shock of bombardment fades as defenders adapt. In Baghdad, the opposite occurred. Each passing day revealed the imbalance. The Mongols had endless timber, endless stones, endless manpower to feed their engines. The Abbasid defenders had only crumbling walls and dwindling supplies. There was no balance, only attrition. Eyewitnesses wrote of walls splitting apart like loaves of bread, their crusts shattering under the impact of boulders. Towers swayed and toppled, their rubble crashing into houses below. Gates, once symbols of authority, groaned under repeated strikes until they splintered. Even those far from the ramparts could hear the city's defenses cracking. What made this destruction so effective was the precision behind it. The Mongols did not merely hurl stones randomly. Their engineers studied the walls, marked weak points, and concentrated fire. They adjusted the angles of release, measured distances, and improved accuracy with every shot. What appeared to the frightened defenders as blind bombardment was, in fact, systematic dismantling. The Mongols also combined machines with cavalry movements. While engines pounded the walls, mounted archers patrolled the encirclement, ensuring no relief force approached. Siege warfare is often thought of as static, but Hülegü's army made it dynamic machines in front, horsemen circling beyond, infantry filling trenches, working as parts of one machine. Even the night offered no respite. By torchlight, engineers wound ropes and hauled counterweights, sending stones into the dark. Fires blazed where incendiaries landed. For Baghdad's people, sleep was broken by crashes, screams, and the tremor of collapsing walls. Siege engines did not only break stone, they broke the rhythm of life itself. One particularly grim tactic was the hurling of corpses into the city. Chroniclers record that plague victims or slaughtered prisoners were sometimes catapulted over the walls, whether to spread disease or terror. The effect was psychological as much as physical. To wake and see broken bodies lying in courtyards was to realize that the siege spared nothing, not even the dead. By early February, sections of Baghdad's outer defenses had collapsed. The engines had done their work. What remained of the walls were breaches wide enough for cavalry to pass. The defenders' counterfire had dwindled to silence. Their own mangonels and trebuchets, poorly built and poorly supplied, had long since fallen quiet. And so the Mongols advanced, not in a sudden rush, but in the measured certainty of engineers, dismantling a structure. The walls of Baghdad were no longer barriers, but ruins. The city was exposed. For the Abbasid capital, the meaning of the siege engines was more than destruction, it was revelation. They revealed how fragile the city's defenses truly were, how overconfidence and neglect had left them vulnerable. They revealed that prestige and piety could not stand against counterweights and ropes. They revealed that history itself could be broken by timber and stone. The fall of Baghdad is often remembered for the massacre that followed, for the rivers dark with ink and blood. But before that came the quieter, more boring truth, the patient work of siege engines grinding down walls with methodical inevitability. It was not a sudden storm, but a slow unmaking. And so, when the walls finally gave way, the people of Baghdad were left with a haunting thought. Had their city fallen to warriors, or had it fallen to machines? For centuries, the Tigris River had been Baghdad's artery of life. It carried grain from apple farms, brought merchants' boats laden with goods, and fed the canals that watered fields across Mesopotamia. Along its banks, the Abbasid capital had flourished, its domes and minarets mirrored in the river's surface. The city was proud of its water, for the Tigris was more than a river, it was a symbol of continuity, stretching back to the dawn of Mesopotamian civilization. But in 1258, that same river became an instrument of siege. Hülegü Khan and his engineers knew that water, like stone, could be shaped into a weapon. The fall of Baghdad was as much a matter of hydraulics as of cavalry and trebuchets. The Mongols had learned the art of river warfare long before they reached Mesopotamia. In northern China, they had faced walled cities defended by moats and rivers. They absorbed the expertise of Chinese engineers who knew how to divert streams, build dams, and control floods. These lessons traveled west with the Mongol armies. By the time they camped outside Baghdad, they carried not only siege towers, but the knowledge to bend the Tigris to their will. The first step was control. The Mongols seized the riverbanks, preventing Baghdad from using the Tigris as a supply line. Barges bringing food or reinforcements could no longer reach the city. Fishermen, once a common sight, vanished. The river was now a frontier bristling with Mongol patrols. For a city dependent on waterborne trade, this was suffocating. Next came manipulation. Engineers dug channels and constructed makeshift dams to alter the flow of water. Canals feeding into the city were cut off, leaving mills dry and fields parched. Others were redirected to flood approaches, undermining walls or creating marshy ground where defenders could not maneuver. Baghdad's mastery of irrigation, a pride of the Abbasid age, was turned against it by foreign engineers who had no reverence for its history. The defenders attempted countermeasures. Chroniclers mention Abbasid forces trying to hold bridges, to maintain ferries, to secure at least part of the river. But Mongol control was absolute. Their cavalry ranged along the banks, swift and disciplined, ensuring no relief could come by water. Even if help had been on its way, the Tigris had been sealed inside the city. The river became an object of both hope and dread. Families fetched water from its edge, but under arrow fire from Mongol scouts. Wells within the walls were insufficient for the population, and as the siege lengthened, thirst grew as dangerous as hunger. Some prayed by the riverbanks, calling on God to protect the Caliph's city. Others whispered that the river itself had betrayed them. And then there was this symbolism. The Tigris had nourished empires since the days of Sumer and Akkad. It had seen Assyrian kings rise and fall, Persian satraps march, and Arab conquerors build new cities. That it should now serve as an accomplice to destruction was almost unbearable. Chroniclers later wrote that the river ran red with blood and black with ink. Corpses and manuscripts alike were cast into its waters. The image was so powerful that it became legend, a memory of civilization itself bleeding into the current. But before that final horror, there was only the slow, methodical weaponization of water, dams and diversions, patrols and blockades, boring mechanics of hydraulics that stripped Baghdad of its lifeline. And so, as the Tigris flowed past the walls of the Abbasid capital, the people wondered with dread. Would the river that had built their city now bear witness to its unmaking? Asterisk. To understand how the Tigris shaped the siege of Baghdad, you must imagine it, not as a backdrop, but as a participant. The river moved through every aspect of the battle, its currents carrying not only water, but fear, strategy, and ultimately ruin in those days before the final breach. The Mongols treated the Tigris as though it were another fortress to be captured. Their engineers dug trenches and threw up earthworks along its banks. They cut canals, redirecting streams to dry out certain approaches and flood others. Boats, simple rafts lashed from timber, ferries captured from the countryside were strung together into pontoon bridges, allowing cavalry to cross from one bank to another with speed. Where the Abbasids saw the river as a line of defense, the Mongols saw only a logistical puzzle to be solved. Control of the river meant control of the city's arteries. Baghdad had always depended on the Tigris for the transport of goods, grain from the north, dates from the south, textiles from further east. All had moved by boat. The siege severed this lifeline in an instant. Barges that once crowded the docks lay idle, their sails folded, their crews scattered. The Caliph's officials tried to requisition boats for defense, but most were destroyed or seized before they could be of use. The city, once open to the world by river, was suddenly cut off, its heartland shrinking to the walls alone. Asterisk. The Mongols also weaponized fear through the river. Scouts patrolled the banks on swift horses, firing arrows at anyone who ventured near. Fishermen, once familiar figures casting nets in the current, vanished. Families who had fetched water daily now trembled to approach the shoreline. The river, once trusted, became dangerous. Its glittering surface reflected not safety, but the menace of enemies who watched every ripple. Inside Baghdad, the river's silence was a wound. No ferries carried passengers from shore to shore. No traders' calls rang out from boats unloading at the docks. The sound of water remained, but stripped of its commerce and bustle. It felt uncanny, like a voice stilled in grief. People who lived along the banks spoke of hearing only the splash of Mongol engineers at work, the creak of pontoons, the thud of timbers dropped into place. The caliphal court, ever bound to ritual, sought to frame the river in religious terms. Preachers reminded worshippers that the Quran describes rivers as signs of God's favor, flowing beneath gardens of paradise. Surely, they said, the Tigris would not betray the caliph's city. But the sermons rang hollow. Each day, the Mongols tightened their control. Water that had been Baghdad's blessing was slowly turning curse, and yet the Tigris carried a deeper weight, memory. For centuries, the river had witnessed the rise and fall of powers. Assyrian kings had marched along its course. Persian satraps had taxed its villages. Arab generals had founded Baghdad itself on its banks. Its currents had outlasted them all. In February 1258, as the Mongols prepared their final assault, the people of Baghdad could not help but wonder whether the river's patience had finally run out, whether it had seen too many empires and was ready to bear witness to another's end. At night, the river reflected fire. Flames from bombardment lit the surface with trembling light, turning water into a shifting mirror of destruction. The people watching from rooftops saw not a river of life, but a ribbon of red and gold, carrying smoke in its reflection. It was as though the Tigris itself was foretelling the city's fate. By then, rumors spread that the Mongols planned to use the river itself to breach the walls. Some whispered of diversions to undermine foundations, others of floods prepared to wash through neighborhoods. Whether true or not, the fear was enough. For the people trapped inside, the Tigris was no longer friend or guardian, accomplice in their siege. And so, as the current flowed silently past their crumbling walls, one question grew sharper. In the minds of the people of Baghdad, would the Tigris remain their lifeline, or would it become the river of their destruction? Asterisk, when the walls of Baghdad finally fell in February 1258, the Tigris ceased to be a silent observer. It became a grave. For centuries, it had borne the weight of boats, markets, and irrigation channels. In the days of the Mongol conquest, it bore, instead, the weight of ruin. Chroniclers describe the river choked with corpses. Men, women, and children, slaughtered in the streets, were cast into the current. Their bodies drifted downstream, colliding with boats, snagging on reeds, sinking beneath the weight of armor or clothing. Witnesses wrote that the river seemed to flow slower under the burden, as if mourning in its own way. The famous house of Wisdom, the great Abbasid library, was another victim. Shelves of manuscripts, scientific treatises, poetry, and histories were flung into the river. Volumes copied lovingly by generations of scholars in Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Syriac were thrown by the cartload. So many books entered the Tigris. Some chroniclers claimed that the river ran black with ink before it ran red with blood. Though the image may be poetic exaggeration, the loss was real. Centuries of learning dissolved into water, carried away. Forever for the survivors inside the city, the Tigris was now a mirror of despair. Where once it had reflected domes and minarets, it now reflected fire and smoke. Ash fell upon its surface. At night, flames danced upon its rippling skin. The sound of water mingled with the cries of the dying, the clatter of looting, the shouts of soldiers. The Mongols themselves used the river as a tool of humiliation. The Caliph al-Mustasim, after capture, was forced to watch as his city was destroyed. Some accounts suggest that his body, after execution, was denied burial and cast into the river. Others deny this, but the rumors alone were enough. The man who had once ruled the Abbasid world was now reduced to nothing. His fate tied to the water that had once been his city's pride. Merchants who survived later, described the river as unnavigable for weeks. Barges overturned or smashed against floating debris. Caravans that had once ended their journeys at Baghdad's docks avoided the city altogether. fearing both plague and devastation. The river, once a highway of wealth, became a scar of ruin. Yet, the Tigris, indifferent to human tragedy, continued to flow. It carried ink, ash, and corpses away, just as it had carried grain and silk in better days. It did not stop for grief or massacre. It simply bore witness, as it had for every empire before, in later centuries. Poets and chroniclers returned again and again to the river in their laments. They imagined it weeping for Baghdad, imagined it remembering the voices of scholars whose words had been drowned, imagined it red with the blood of innocents. Whether these images were literal or metaphorical mattered little. The Tigris had become the symbol of the city's destruction, the place where civilization's treasures dissolved into nothingness. The Mongols left Baghdad in ruin, but the river remained. It outlasted the Abbasids, outlasted the Ilkhanate, outlasted every power that rose and fell along its banks. The city rebuilt in fragments, then in greater strength under later dynasties. But the memory of 1258 never washed away. For generations, the image of the river filled with ink and blood haunted Baghdad's identity. And so, the story of the siege cannot be told without the Tigris. It was lifeline, prison, weapon, and grave. It was the stage upon which the city's greatness had been built, and the stage upon which its ruin was carried. Downstream, the question left behind is not only historical, but human. Does the river remember the tragedies it carries, or does it simply flow on, leaving memory to those who watched its waters darken? For centuries, Baghdad's pride had not been its walls, nor even its palaces, but its knowledge. At the center of this intellectual life stood the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. It was not merely a library, but a hub of translation, study, and preservation. From Greek philosophy to Indian mathematics, from Persian astronomy to Arabic poetry, its shelves held the wisdom of civilizations. Scholars gathered there to copy, translate, and debate. Scribes bent over parchment by lamplight, their reed pens scratching the words of Aristotle, Galen, Al-Khwarizmi, and countless others into fresh volumes. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the House of Wisdom had been the brightest light of the Islamic Golden Age. Under caliphs like Alman, scholars were sponsored to collect texts from Byzantium, Persia, and beyond. Translators rendered Greek into Arabic, preserving works that might otherwise have been lost forever. Astronomers built instruments to measure the heavens. Mathematicians refined algebra. Physicians copied treatises that guided hospitals for generations. Baghdad, through this institution, became a city not only of markets and mosques, but of ideas. But by the 13th century, the glow of the House of Wisdom had already dimmed. The Abbasid caliphs no longer commanded the wealth and stability of earlier centuries. Patronage declined, scholars scattered, and the library's central role waned. Yet its prestige endured. To the people of Baghdad, the Beit al-Hikmah was still a symbol of their city's greatness. It's proof that they were heirs to knowledge stretching back to Babylon and Greece. When Hülegü's armies approached, the scholars and scribes of Baghdad must have felt dread more acute than most. They had copied histories of past invasions, read accounts of empires fallen, translated descriptions of cities destroyed. They knew what conquest meant, not only for walls and bodies, but for words. Some perhaps tried to secure precious manuscripts to hide them in cellars or mosques, but the scale of the collection made concealment impossible. Others clung to their work, continuing to copy as though persistence could outlast the siege. Inside the library halls, silence deepened as the days of bombardment grew louder outside. The scratching of pens was drowned by the crash of trebuchet stones. The murmur of debate faded beneath the cries of collapsing towers. The scholars, once voices of reason and curiosity, became hushed witnesses, aware that their world of parchment and ink was fragile before horsemen and fire. We do not know their names. Chroniclers rarely preserved the identities of the librarians and copyists. We know of generals, caliphs, and conquerors, but the scribes who bent over manuscripts in those final days are faceless. If they represent the true loss of 1258, not only lives, the slow work of centuries, undone in hours later. Accounts claim that after Baghdad fell, the House of Wisdom was destroyed completely. Books were flung into the Tigris, their ink staining the waters. Others were burned, their ash carried on the wind. Whether these details are exact or embellished, the truth is that much was lost. Caste that has survived from ancient Greece, Persia, and India vanished. Whole chains of transmission broke. Knowledge that had passed through generations of careful copying simply ended. But before that moment of ruin, in those last days of the siege, the House of Wisdom still stood. Its doors still opened, its shelves still groaned with volumes, its scribes still dipped pens in ink. The city around them trembled, but within those walls, for a few final days, knowledge persisted. The question that lingers is haunting. Did the scholars of Baghdad know they were copying their words for the last time? Oh, did they believe, even then, that learning would protect them? Asterisk, as the Mongol siege dragged on. The contrast between the thunder outside and the silence inside the House of Wisdom became unbearable. The library had been built for preservation, but preservation depends on continuity, of rulers who protect, of wealth that sponsors, of scribes who copy. In 1258, that continuity was about to break. The scribes who worked there knew the fragility of their task. Every manuscript was vulnerable to fire, to decay, to loss. That was why copying was endless notebook was truly safe until it existed in many hands. In Baghdad, that copying had gone on for centuries. Generations of men bent over wooden desks, pressing reed pens into parchment, recording knowledge one careful stroke at a time. It was monotonous work, but its value lay precisely in its monotony. The House of Wisdom was built on repetition. By the 13th century, its collections included not only Arabic originals, but Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, Persian medicine, Syriac theology, and Chinese astronomy. To walk through its shelves was to walk across civilizations. Scrolls and codices lay side by side, some copied in elegant calligraphy, others rough but functional. The margins were filled with notes, commentary, arguments, scribbled by generations of scholars. It was not only a library, but a conversation. Across centuries, during the siege, however, the conversations fell silent. Chroniclers do not record debates or lectures in those final weeks. Instead, they speak of fear, of scholars who stopped coming, of scribes who fled, of silence falling over the once bustling halls. Some likely carried a few volumes with them, smuggling texts into hiding. Others may have continued their work, stubbornly believing that writing one more copy was still worthwhile. Even as the ground shook with bombardment, the Mongols were not ignorant of knowledge. They valued astronomy, engineering, and administration. But their conquest was not gentle. When Baghdad fell, the library was not preserved as treasure. It was treated as spoil. Books were thrown aside, manuscripts used as fuel or discarded into the river. For the conquerors, parchment and ink were worthless compared to gold, grain, or labor. Accounts of the destruction are tinged with sorrow and exaggeration. Yet even the exaggerations reveal truth. Chroniclers wrote that the Tigris ran black with ink as volumes dissolved in its waters. They imagined fish swimming through words, letters staining their scales. They told of the weight of books bending the river's flow. These images may be poetic, but they reflect the magnitude of the loss, a civilization's memory, drowned in its own river. What is most tragic is how ordinary the final hours of the House of Wisdom must have been. Soldiers breaking doors, shelves overturned, scrolls bundled and thrown, inkpots spilling, scribes scattered, perhaps cut down as they tried to shield their work. There was no dramatic defense, no heroic last stand. Knowledge does not fight. It only endures as long as it is copied, read, and protected. Once neglected, once unprotected, it vanishes quietly in the aftermath. Only fragments survived. Some works had already traveled Greek texts to Byzantium, Arabic commentaries to Spain, medical treatises to Cairo, but many others ended in Baghdad when the library was broken. So too were the lines of transmission. Scholars in later centuries would lament that they could only guess at what had been lost. Whole branches of thought may have disappeared, not because they were refuted, but because their parchments floated downstream. And so, the House of Wisdom ended not in debate, but in silence. Its shelves emptied, its scribes vanished, its conversation, across centuries, interrupted. The haunting thought that remains is this: how much of human knowledge has been lost, not to argument or rejection, but to fire, water, and neglect erasures, so quiet that we may never even know what is missing. Asterisk, when Baghdad finally fell in February 1258, the House of Wisdom ceased to exist, not with a blaze of resistance, but with the quiet unraveling of centuries of labor. Knowledge, unlike walls or armies, cannot defend itself. Its guardians are fragile. Scholars, scribes, paper, ink, against trebuchets, cavalry, and fire. These are powerless. The Mongol soldiers who stormed into the library complex were not there for books. They sought wealth, captives, and plunder. Shelves were overturned, scrolls trampled, manuscripts flung aside. Chests of paper were emptied into the streets. For the conquerors, words on parchment had no weight compared to grain or silver. The destruction of the library was not a single moment, but a process. Books were used as kindling, manuscripts piled in courtyards and set alight. Others were carted to the river and dumped, their pages dissolving as the Tigris carried them away. Chroniclers who witnessed the aftermath wrote with grief, describing the river as dark with ink, its currents clogged with letters. Whether literal or metaphorical, the image captured the truth. A civilization's memory had been scattered on the water. For the scholars and scribes who survived, silence replaced conversation. Their lives, work, translation, commentary, copying was gone in hours. Imagine a man who had spent decades preserving Galen's medical treatises or refining astronomical tables, watching those volumes thrown into fire. Imagine a scribe who had copied Aristotle word by word, line by line, seeing the parchment float downstream. Their grief must have been unbearable, yet it left little record. Scholars were not warriors. They did not command armies. Most simply, disappeared into the anonymity of conquest. The loss was not only Baghdad's. The House of Wisdom had gathered manuscripts from across empires, storing them in one place. Its destruction meant that works preserved for centuries were broken in a single week. Some had traveled westward before the fall, reaching Cordoba or Toledo. Others had been carried eastward to Cairo or Damascus, but much remained only in Baghdad, and when the city burned, so too did those unique voices. The silence that followed was not a gap of years, but of entire traditions. Later generations would romanticize the loss. Poets imagined the river whispering with drowned words. Chroniclers spoke of an age of light extinguished. In truth, the House of Wisdom had already waned by 1258, its golden age long past. But even in decline, its destruction symbolized the fragility of knowledge, that centuries of slow, careful work could be undone in days by war. And yet, the silence was not absolute. Knowledge is resilient in fragments. Copies of many works survived elsewhere, carried by scholars who had left Baghdad before the fall. Astronomy flourished in Moraga under Hülegü's own patronage, using some of the traditions preserved by Baghdad's scholars. Medical treatises that had passed through the city appeared in Cairo, Damascus, and even Europe. Litty destruction was vast, but not total. Still, the image of Baghdad's library vanishing into the Tigris has endured for centuries as a symbol of irretrievable loss. We do not know what was lost, what treatises, what poems, what calculations might have changed the course of later science or art. That is the most haunting part. The absence is invisible, a silence that no record can fill. The story of the house of wisdom does not end with fire or water alone. It ends with a question, left open by every scholar who laments its fall. How much of human history lies not in what we remember, but in what has already been forgotten forever? Asterisk. To understand the fall of Baghdad, one must not only read the chronicles of caliphs, generals, and conquerors, but also imagine the lives of those who were never named. The merchants in the bazaars, the washerwomen at the river, the apprentices in workshops, the children playing in courtyards. These people formed the true body of the city. Es Halav, Wives O. Hülegü Khan's armies encircled Baghdad. Their daily routines collided with the slow terror of siege. Baghdad, at the time, was a city of nearly 1 million souls, sprawling along both banks of the Tigris. Its markets overflowed with good spices from India, silk from China, wool from Anatolia, glassware from Syria. Narrow streets bustled with noise, the call of sellers, the bray of donkeys, the hiss of food frying in pans. To live in Baghdad was to be surrounded by motion and sound, by the layered smells of bread baking, canneries working, and incense burning in mosques. Asterisk. Even as Mongol armies drew near, many of these routines continued. The weaver still sat at his loom, threading wool into patterned cloth. The blacksmith still hammered iron, sparks leaping into the dim light of his forge. The baker still kneaded dough, sliding loaves into hot ovens. For the poor especially, life left little room for contemplation of geopolitics. A family's concern was not the fate of the Abbasid Caliphate, but whether there would be bread for supper. Yet, anxiety seeped in. Refugees from the countryside arrived daily, their faces lined with fear. They brought stories of Mongol devastations, villages burned, crops trampled, whole communities massacred. In the tea houses and mosques, these stories spread like smoke, debated and exaggerated until no one could tell where rumor ended and truth began. Some dismissed them, saying God would never allow the Caliph's city to fall. Others whispered that the Mongols had never been defeated, that their advance was unstoppable. Daily life grew more crowded and strained. The influx of refugees swelled, the population within the walls pushing rents higher and food scarcer. Inns overflowed, markets became choked, and alleyways filled with families huddled under makeshift shelters. For residents already struggling, the newcomers were both kin in suffering and competitors for dwindling resources. Markets reflected the tension most clearly. For the siege fully closed in, grain prices soared. Merchants who once sold flour by the sack began measuring it in handfuls. Chickpeas, dates, and onions, all staples of the poor, doubled or tripled in price. Wealthy households hoarded what they could. The poor relied on scraps or on the charity of mosques. Women went daily to the markets with smaller and smaller coins, returning with less and less. Children, too, felt the shift. Where once they had played in courtyards and chased each other along narrow lanes, they now heard the adults' whispers and watched the sky for smoke. Their games turned toward imitation. Some pretended to be Mongols, others defenders on the walls. Even in play, The shadow of siege crept in. Religious life offered both comfort and unease. Mosques filled with worshippers praying for divine intervention. Friday's sermons thundered with reminders of God's power and the caliph's sacred role. Yet beneath the surface, doubt lingered. Some asked quietly why, if the Abbasid Caliphate was truly protected, the Mongols had conquered so many Muslim lands. Already, others clung all the harder to faith, insisting that the city's holiness would repel any invader. Night in Baghdad during the siege had its own atmosphere. Streets darkened except for lanterns hung by doorways. Families huddled indoors, whispering stories, reciting Quran, or sitting in silence as the distant sound of Mongol engines echoed through the air. The ordinary noises of the city, the laughter from taverns, the songs of boatmen, the barking of dogs, were replaced by a heavy quiet, broken only by the thud of stones striking the walls. It is easy to forget, in the scale of chronicles, that Baghdad was not only a capital, but a community of ordinary routines. In those days before its fall, every loaf of bread, every bucket of water, every whispered rumor mattered more than the caliph's counsel, for the nameless thousands who lived through it. History was not a tale of empires, but of survival. The question that hung in their homes, unspoken but ever present, was simple. Would tomorrow bring another day of routine, or would it bring the end of everything they had ever known? Asterisk, as the Mongols' grip tightened around Baghdad, the everyday rhythms of the city became distorted. Ordinary Baghdadis found themselves living in two worlds at once: the familiar pulse of domestic chores and market routines, and the slow dread of siege pressing in from beyond the walls. The tension between these worlds grew heavier with each passing day. Food was the first daily ritual to change. Families who once purchased grain in bulk now rationed handfuls of flour. Bread, which had been the cornerstone of every meal, shrank in size and quality. Bakers stretched dough with husks, or ground date pits, producing loaves darker, coarser, and less nourishing. Wealthier households might still obtain rice, lamb, or spices, but only at staggering prices. For the poor, the daily diet reduced to watery stews and stale bread. Mothers whispered apologies as they handed children bowls that filled the stomach, but left hunger lingering down. Water, too, became uncertain. The Tigris still flowed, but Mongol control of its banks made access dangerous. Wells within the city provided some relief, but many were shallow, their water brackish or foul. Women carrying jars lined up for hours, often returning home with less than they needed. Bathhouses, once a symbol of Baghdad's refinement, fell silent. The steam that had once risen daily from hammam domes vanished as water grew scarce and fuel, too, was costly. Workshops and markets struggled. The carpenter's shop, the tanner's yard, the glassblower's furnace all depended on steady supplies of raw materials. With the siege, caravans no longer arrived. Timber, hides, and sand became rare. Some craftsmen closed their shutters entirely, while others adapted, pairing old goods, patching worn shoes, reshaping broken jars. The economy of Baghdad shifted from abundance to makeshift survival. And yet, even in crisis, people sought continuity. In the bazaars, sellers still called out, though their voices carried more desperation than confidence. Children still played, though their games were punctuated by the dull thuds of siege stones. Weddings, though fewer, still occurred. Families clung to tradition, believing that life must continue, even under threat. Bride might wear simpler garments. A groom offer humbler feasts. But the ritual of union endured. Religious life intensified. Mosques overflowed with prayers for deliverance. Preachers urged repentance, declaring that sin had brought calamity. Families donated what little they had to the poor, hoping for divine favor. Quran recitations filled the nights, the rhythmic chanting blending with the distant crash of trebuchets. For some, faith grew sharper, a bulwark against despair. For others, doubt crept in. Why had God allowed such enemies to prosper? Why did the Caliph not act with strength? These questions were whispered, never shouted, but they gnawed at confidence. Fear reshaped neighborhoods. At night, families barred doors and huddled together. Rumors spread quickly of Mongol spies already inside, of collaborators marking houses, of traitors preparing to open gates. Some accused outsiders, the refugees who had crowded into the city's secret allies, of the enemy. Suspicion divided communities, fraying bonds that had once held strong. Children, especially, carried the weight of the siege in ways adults could not always see. They watched their parents argue over scraps of food, saw their mothers cry at empty cupboards, heard the crash of siege engines like thunder in the night. Some withdrew into silence. Others grew restless, their play reflecting the violence around them. Wooden swords and makeshift bows became common toys, their games echoing the war they could not escape. Yet, in all this, Baghdad's spirit showed itself in quiet resilience. Neighbors shared what little they had. Families pooled grain, exchanged tools, took in the homeless. Merchants extended credit even when repayment was uncertain. Teachers continued to instruct small groups of children, using whatever texts remained at hand. It was not prosperity, but it was survival. For the ordinary Baghdadi, history was not written in chronicles or decrees. It was lived in the rationing of bread, the queuing for water, the whispers of fear at night. Each day became a negotiation with scarcity and dread. Each small act of endurance, a victory. And as the siege dragged on, grim thought grew harder to push aside. Was this endurance leading to salvation? Or was it only a way of stretching suffering before the inevitable fall? By early February 1258, the lives of ordinary Baghdadis had narrowed to essentials: bread, water, and survival. The city's walls were cracking under Mongol stones, but for most families, the battle was not fought at the ramparts. It was fought in kitchens, markets, and alleys where scarcity gnawed away at both body and spirit. Hunger had become constant. Grain reserves were nearly gone, and what remained was hidden or hoarded. In poorer quarters, families boiled grass, ground bones, or made thin gruel from whatever they could find. The smell of baking bread, once common in every street, now became a rare and painful reminder. Mothers tore scraps of food into tiny portions, trying to feed many mouths with little. Children cried themselves to sleep. For the poor, famine was as deadly as any Mongol sword. Water was no better. The Tigris, once a friend, was now under Mongol control. Families skewed at wells that yielded only brackish trickles. Buckets clattered against stone. Arguments flared as neighbors accused one another of taking too much. Hammams closed, fountains dried, and the city once known for its refinement became foul with waste and thirst. Disease followed, spreading in the crowded quarters where families slept huddled together. The streets told the story of collapse. Markets, once overflowing with goods, now offered little but desperation. Stalls were empty, shutters nailed shut, shopkeepers gone. Instead of the calls of sellers, one heard whispers of fear and the cries of the hungry. Apprentices sat idle, their masters unable to work without materials. Caravans no longer arrived. The arteries of commerce had been cut. Baghdad, once the crossroads of the world, felt like a sealed tomb. Yet, even in despair, fragments of normal life clung on. Children still played in alleys, their games twisted by the siege, building walls of mud only to knock them down, imitating trebuchets with stones, or pretending to storm imaginary gates. Weddings, though rare, still occurred in hushed ceremonies. The faith that life must continue, even under shadow, kept families holding to rituals that made them feel human. In mosques, prayers grew more desperate. Moms preached that repentance could yet bring deliverance. Worshippers filled the halls, their voices trembling as they recited verses over and over, tears streaking their faces. Some believed, some doubted, but all turned to prayer because there was nothing else to turn to. For the city that had once prided itself on its scholarship and wealth, the siege stripped away everything until only faith remained. Suspicion, however, grew sharper. Refugees were accused of betrayal. Neighbors accused one another of hoarding. Families whispered that the Caliph cared little for their suffering, feasting in his palace while they starved. Trust frayed, and the city that had once been united by commerce and culture splintered under pressure. When the walls finally cracked and Mongol soldiers surged into the city, ordinary Baghdadis faced their end not as warriors, but as civilians, caught in catastrophe. Many were cut down in the streets. Others fled toward the Tigris, only to find its waters filled with corpses. Homes were looted, markets burned, families scattered. What makes their story haunting is how quiet much of it was. They did not fight in battles chronicled by historians. They lived through hunger, thirst, rumor, and silence, till silence claimed them entirely. Their names are gone, their lives unrecorded. Yet they were the majority, the true body of Baghdad. Erased in days, the chronicles preserved the deeds of Mongol generals and the fate of the Caliph. But the greater loss was in these nameless thousands, whose daily routines of bread making, water fetching, and market selling were swept away. Their lives remind us that history is not only written in palaces and sieges, but in the ordinary patterns that vanish unnoticed. The question that lingers after their silence is this: when cities fall, is it the rulers who are remembered, or the people who are forgotten first? Asterisk. The Mongols conquered with arrows, cavalry, and siege engines, but just as powerful was a quieter weapon: fear, for they reached Baghdad in 1258. Their reputation had already broken the will of cities from Central Asia to Persia. Stories of their cruelty traveled faster than their armies, carried by refugees and merchants. Still, entire regions surrendered at the mere sight of Mongol banners. From the very beginning, the Mongols understood that terror could be strategic. When Genghis Khan first launched campaigns into Khwarezm in the early 13th century, he made examples of resisting cities, Otra, Bukhara, Samarkand each, that dared to resist faced massacre. Chroniclers describe fields littered with bodies, walls razed to rubble, rivers clogged with corpses. These images spread not only through survivors, but through deliberate Mongol messengers who carried warnings to the next city. Submission would bring survival, resistance, annihilation. By the time Hülegü Khan marched west, this reputation was decades old and deeply ingrained. Entire towns fled before his armies even arrived, abandoning homes in panic. Villages surrendered without resistance, hoping to avoid destruction. In some cases, they were spared. In others, they were slaughtered anyway, reinforcing the lesson. That fear was not only justified, but necessary. The messages of fear were simple but effective. They took many forms: envoys and letters, often demanding surrender under threat of extermination. These letters were blunt, sometimes accompanied by the severed heads of captured envoys from earlier resistances. Refugees pouring into nearby cities, carrying tales of slaughter that no one could ignore. Their testimonies may have been exaggerated, but exaggeration only magnified the terror. Deliberate massacres, chosen not at random, but as warnings. When Nishaper resisted in 1221, the resulting massacre of perhaps hundreds of thousands was remembered for generations. The Mongols ensured that such stories spread, where each retelling made future battles easier by the time Baghdad's walls came into view. The city's people had already heard years of such accounts. They knew of Herat, where tens of thousands were slain. They knew of Merv, where entire populations were killed. They knew of Alamet, the Ismaili fortress once thought impregnable, brought down by Hülegü's siege engines. Each of these became part of a grim narrative, repeated in Baghdad's markets. The Mongols could not be resisted. The psychological effect was profound. Even before the first trebuchet stone was launched at Baghdad, many within the city had already surrendered in spirit. Ordinary people whispered that resistance was useless. Okay, some soldiers deserted, fearing they would die in vain. Indecision was sharpened by these currents of despair. How could he rally his people when they believed defeat was certain? The genius of Mongol fear was its economy. To destroy one city was costly, to frighten 10 into surrender was efficient. Fear multiplied their power far beyond numbers. It meant that even when their forces were stretched across vast territories, their reputation acted as a second army, conquering minds before bodies. This was not an accidental cruelty, but a deliberate policy. Chroniclers record Mongol commanders discussing how to leave survivors in order to spread news. It was terror used as communication, a grim kind of propaganda, where today nations broadcast threats through radio or pamphlets. The Mongols broadcast with corpses, ruins, and wandering refugees. Baghdad, with its ancient prestige, may have believed itself immune, but the people within its walls had already been conquered by stories. Each rumor repeated in a bazaar, each tale whispered in a courtyard, eroded the city's resolve. By the time Hülegü encamped outside, much of his work was already done, and so the question lingered over every city that heard the approach of the Mongols. Did they fall because of siege engines and cavalry? Or did they fall because fear itself had opened their gates long before? The Mongols were not the first conquerors to use fear, but they perfected it into a system. Their campaigns across Central Asia, Khorasan, and Persia reveal how calculated brutality became a message broadcast across entire regions. The mechanics of this fear were as deliberate as the mechanics of their siege engines. Consider Nishaper in 1221. The city resisted Mongol demands, and when it finally fell, the result was catastrophic. Chroniclers claim that hundreds of thousands were slaughtered, though numbers are uncertain. What is clear is that the devastation was intentional. Survivors were few, chosen carefully to spread the story. These survivors became living messengers. Their testimonies carried on caravans and in refugee columns. By the time their words reached the next city, fear had already softened its defenses. Merv, another great city of Khorasan, offers a similar lesson. When it resisted, the Mongols unleashed such thorough destruction that even neighboring towns whispered of it for years. Refugees who escaped spoke of entire populations killed in a matter of days. Whether exaggerated or not, the reports served their purpose. They made resistance seem suicidal. The Mongols also used theatrical displays of terror. Heads were piled into pyramids outside conquered cities. Corpses were left unburied to rot in the sun. Streets were turned into silent graveyards. These images were not merely aftermath. They were messages. See what happens if you resist. Fear became a form of diplomacy. Mongol envoys often arrived at city gates with letters demanding submission. The language was stark promises of safety if obeyed, threats of annihilation if defied. City leaders faced an impossible calculation: surrender and risk humiliation, or resist and risk extermination. In many cases, they chose surrender, not out of loyalty, but out of terror. By the time Hülegü advanced toward Baghdad, dozens of cities had already fallen through fear as much as force. Alamet, the Ismaili stronghold in the mountains of Persia, was one such example. Though defended by determined fighters, its myth of invincibility collapsed after Mongol siege engines reduced its walls. The news of Alamedd's fall carried as much weight as the destruction itself, for it proved that even the strongest fortresses could not resist. Baghdad's citizens, hearing these stories, lived in a dual reality. On one hand, they went about daily tasks, baking bread, fetching water, praying in mosques. On the other, they carried within them a dread that no act of faith or courage could dispel. Refugees in the markets whispered of Nishaper, Merv, and Alamat. Children overheard their parents speaking of rivers running red with blood. Fear seeped into every corner of the city, even before a single Mongol arrow flew. This fear eroded unity. When people believe defeat is inevitable, loyalty to rulers weakens. Soldiers doubt their commanders. Citizens question their leaders. Trust decays, and division spreads. Team to Mongols, by reputation alone, had already fractured the morale of Baghdad's defenders. The brilliance of this method lay in its efficiency. To conquer by siege required months. To conquer by terror required only a reputation. A single massacre could echo across a continent, saving the Mongols time, men, and resources. Fear multiplied their presence, making their armies seem larger, stronger, more inevitable than they were. As the Mongols advanced, their reputation arrived ahead of them. By the time their banners appeared on the horizon, many cities were already conquered in spirit. Baghdad was no exception. And so, in those final days before its fall, the city's greatest enemy may not have been trebuchets or cavalry, but despair. The question whispered in its bazaars was not whether the Mongols could be resisted, but had Baghdad already surrendered in its heart long before its walls were breached. By the time Hülegü Khan's army appeared outside Baghdad in January 1258, the city was already haunted by other people's ghosts. Stories of Nishaper, Merv, Herat, and countless smaller towns had seeped into its markets, its mosques, and its homes. Fear had done half the work before the first stone from a trebuchet struck the walls. Chroniclers describe how refugees arriving from Persia and Khorasan carried not only hunger and exhaustion, but memories. They spoke of streets paved with corpses, of cities where no dog barked because no living creature remained, of pyramids of skulls left as monuments. These tales may have been exaggerated, but exaggeration was the point. The Mongols themselves encouraged such accounts, knowing that imagination could terrify more deeply than reality. For ordinary Baghdadis, the effect was paralyzing. Families debated whether to flee, though most had nowhere to go. Soldiers wondered whether to fight, though they had heard that armies greater than theirs had been annihilated. Merchants muttered that surrender might spare their goods. Each rumor spread faster than orders from the Caliph's palace. The result was disunity. Some clung to faith, others to denial, but few clung to confidence. Inside the Abbasid court, fear shaped decisions as well. All Mustasim's advisors could not agree. Should they negotiate, resist, or hope for divine intervention? Each argument was shadowed by the knowledge of what had happened elsewhere. When even Alamedd had fallen, when even Merv had been obliterated, what chance did Baghdad truly have? The debates turned in circles, paralyzed by the very terror that should have spurred action. The Mongols knew how to heighten this paralysis. Their envoys demanded surrender with blunt clarity. Yield and live, resist and die. They showed no hesitation, no weakness. Their army encircled the city with calm efficiency, signaling inevitability. For the defenders, the contrast was crushing. Indecision inside, certainty outside. When the bombardment began, confirmed what fear had already taught. Resistance was futile. The trebuchets pounded with a monotonous rhythm, each stone striking not only the walls, but the people's morale. As breaches widened, Many Baghdadis felt the collapse was not an event unfolding, but an event already decided. This was the genius and the horror of the Mongol strategy. They conquered twice, once in rumor and once in reality. The first conquest, by fear, softened cities so that the second, by arms, required less effort. Baghdad was no different. Its walls fell in days, but its spirit had been falling for years under the weight of stories. The aftermath only reinforced the legend. The massacre that followed, the destruction of libraries, the drowning of knowledge in the Tigris, became new tales of terror carried to Damascus, Cairo, and beyond. The cycle repeated. Destruction in one city became surrender in the next. And so, when we look back at Baghdad's fall, we must see not only siege, engines, and cavalry, but the invisible armies of rumor and fear. It was those stories, whispered in bazaars and carried by refugees, that weakened the city before the Mongols ever arrived. The question history leaves us is unsettling. Do cities fall because enemies break their walls, or because fear has already broken their will to resist?